After my husband Floyd died, his sons demanded, "We want the house, the accounts, everything." My lawyer begged me to fight back. I said, "Give them exactly what they're asking for." Everyone thought grief had destroyed my mind. At the final hearing, I signed every document with a steady hand. Sydney and Edwin smiled like they'd won the lottery until their attorney's face went white. When he realized they'd inherited properties worth millions along with mortgages that exceeded their value. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The Medicare bills were still piling up when Floyd's sons decided I was too confused to manage my own life. I sat in our Sacramento kitchen, the same table where Floyd and I had shared coffee every morning for 23 years. Watching two men who looked like my husband but had none of his heart. Sydney, 45 and sharp as a blade, wore his grief like an expensive suit perfectly tailored to hide his gambling debts underneath. His eyes swept over me with the cold calculation of someone appraising property he desperately needed to acquire. "Colleen," he said, using that patronizing tone that made my skin crawl, "we need to discuss some practical matters." Edwin, 3 years younger but somehow looking decades older with his soft edges and synthetic sympathy, nodded along like a puppet. "This is hard for all of us," he added, as if he'd been the one holding Floyd's hand through those final hospital nights. As if he'd been the one discovering mysterious Medicare charges for doctors I'd never seen. Hard for all of us. The lie tasted bitter in the air between us. They'd been creating fake medical appointments in my name. Submitting Social Security modifications I never authorized, claiming I had cognitive decline that required their management. They thought a brass key hidden in Floyd's desk drawer was just another old piece of junk. What they didn't know was that Floyd had spent his last months documenting their every move. What they couldn't imagine was that a confused old widow might have a safety deposit box full of evidence and a protected account they'd never found. I gave them exactly what they demanded. And they never asked what it would cost them. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let's get started. The kitchen still smelled like Floyd's coffee. 3 weeks since the funeral, and Colleen Whitaker couldn't bring herself to wash his favorite mug. It sat on the counter beside her pill organizer, both items catching the pale Sacramento morning light through curtains she hadn't opened in days. Her fingers moved automatically across the plastic compartments. Monday through Sunday, morning, noon, evening. The blood pressure medicine rattled like small stones. She pressed each lid down with a soft click, the routine steadying her hands even when her mind wandered to places it shouldn't go. The stack of mail waited on the kitchen table. Medicare EOB forms, mostly. She'd learned to read the codes over the years, but these new ones made her stomach tight. Neurology consult. Cognitive screening. She traced the line with her fingertip, trying to remember when she'd seen Drive. Brennan. The paper felt thin between her fingers, almost fragile. "I can't fall apart now," she whispered to the empty room. The words hung in the air like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Floyd's home office drew her like it always did when the house felt too quiet. The leather chair still held the shape of his shoulders. His cologne lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the scent of old paper and dust motes dancing in the window light. She pressed her palm against the armrest where he used to rest his elbow, feeling the worn spots his elbows had made over 23 years. The desk drawers opened with their familiar squeak. She needed a pen, something simple, but her hand stopped when her fingers touched cold metal. A small brass key, tucked behind the calculator she'd bought him for Christmas 5 years ago. She lifted it to the light, watching it catch the sun. The metal warmed in her palm, but she had no idea what it opened. Car tires crunched on the gravel driveway. Colleen slipped the key into her cardigan pocket and walked to the living room window. A black BMW sat in her driveway, sleek and expensive against the modest neighborhood backdrop. Sydney and Edwin Whitaker stepped out in dark suits that looked freshly pressed, their shoes polished to mirrors. Her stepsons had arrived. Sydney knocked twice, then let himself in with his spare key. "Hello, Mother." His voice carried the warmth of a business meeting. He kissed her cheek, the gesture quick and perfunctory, smelling of aftershave and something else she couldn't name. Power, maybe. or ambition. Edwin followed, softer around the edges but wearing the same calculating expression. How are you holding up? He set his hand on her shoulder, the pressure gentle but somehow claiming. We've been worried. I'm managing, Colleen said, smoothing her skirt with both hands. They moved through her house like they owned it. Sydney's eyes swept the living room, cataloging items she couldn't see. Edwin went straight to Floyd's office, calling over his shoulder, we should talk about the estate, Colleen. Dad would want things handled properly. She found them both at Floyd's desk, papers already spread across the surface like they'd been planning this conversation for weeks. Sydney flipped Floyd's wedding photo face down with 2 fingers, a casual motion that landed in Colleen's chest like a small slap. The frame made a tiny thud against the wood. There's quite a bit to sort through, Edwin said, opening a folder she hadn't seen before. His voice stayed gentle, caring. We want to help you through this. It's overwhelming, we know. Sydney pulled out a chair for her, the gesture polite but somehow making her feel like a guest in her own home. The probate process can be complex for someone who hasn't dealt with it before. Colleen sat, folding her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. Floyd explained some things to me. Of course he did. Sydney's smile didn't reach his eyes. But the legal requirements have changed. There are deadlines, tax implications. We don't want you to get in trouble. Edwin slid a document across the desk toward her. The paper was thick, expensive looking, with terms that swam together when she tried to focus. Representative payee, authorization, temporary management. The words felt like a foreign language designed to exclude her. Just preliminary forms, Edwin said. To protect your interests. Colleen pulled the papers closer, squinting at the small print. Sydney's pen tapped against the desk, a rhythmic sound that needled her nerves. When she looked up, both men were watching her with the same expression she'd seen on car salesmen and insurance adjusters. Patient but impatient. I'd like to read these carefully, she said. Of course. Sydney's voice stayed smooth. Take your time, but she could feel their restlessness in the way Edwin's foot tapped soundlessly against the chair leg, in the way Sydney checked his phone twice while she tried to parse through words that should have been simple but somehow weren't. That evening, after they'd gone, her phone started ringing. The screen showed a blocked number, then went dark, then lit up again with another blocked call. She watched it buzz against the kitchen counter where she'd left it beside the Medicare EOBs, the vibration making the papers rustle. The 4th call came as she was brushing her teeth. The 5th while she was checking the locks. By the 6th, her hands were shaking as she turned the phone face down and walked away from it. But she could still hear it buzzing in the kitchen, insistent and wrong. Rain ticked against the windows like tiny fingers tapping for attention. The house settled around her with its familiar creaks and sighs, but tonight everything sounded different. Threatening, somehow. The next morning brought another envelope on the kitchen table. Social Security Administration, the return address read in bold letters. She tore it open with careful fingers, afraid of what she might find. Benefit change notification. Address update pending. Representative payee review requested. She hadn't requested anything. The paper trembled in her hands as she read the same lines over and over, trying to make sense of words that felt like they were describing someone else's life. Someone confused. Someone who needed help managing her own affairs. When Edwin called that afternoon, his voice carried the same gentle concern she'd heard in Floyd's office. Don't worry about the paperwork, Colleen. These things happen all the time. We'll take care of everything. I didn't ask for any changes, she said. Sometimes the system automatically reviews accounts after a spouse passes. It's probably nothing. But when he came by an hour later with coffee and pastries from her favorite bakery, she watched him slide the Social Security letter under his folder like it was just another piece of mail. His thumb pressed the corner down, holding it there while he talked about funeral flowers and thank you cards. And how proud Floyd would be of how well she was handling everything. Too casual, too practiced. Colleen moved the brass key 3 times that evening. First from her cardigan pocket to the coin dish by the front door. Then from the coin dish to the kitchen drawer beside the can opener. Finally from the drawer to her purse, where it nestled against her Medicare card like a secret that wouldn't stay hidden. She stood in the hallway outside Floyd's office, looking at the closed door. The house hummed around her with its late-night sounds, the refrigerator cycling on, the heater clicking, the foundation settling into silence. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. But for the first time in 23 years, she felt like an intruder in her own home. Like someone who might be asked to leave at any moment, politely but firmly, for her own good. The brass key felt warm in her purse. Floyd had hidden it for a reason. And now, standing in the hallway where they'd said good morning to each other thousands of times, Colleen understood that her real education was just beginning. In her own home, she suddenly felt like a guest who could be evicted. Colleen spread the Medicare EOB pages across her kitchen table like puzzle pieces that refused to fit together. The paper edges whispered against the wood as she smoothed them flat with both palms, trying to press down the panic rising in her chest. Each form had Floyd's name crossed out in blue ink, replaced with hers in handwriting she didn't recognize. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting shadows that made the medical codes blur together. One line kept drawing her eye: neurological consultation, cognitive screening evaluation, drive. Marcus Brennan. She traced the letters with her fingertip, searching her memory for any appointment, any conversation, any moment that would make this charge real. Nothing. The coffee maker gurgled in the background, the same morning sound she'd heard for decades, but today it felt like static interference. She pulled out her reading glasses, the ones Floyd had helped her pick at the optometrist last year, and read the line again. The date showed 3 weeks ago, right after the funeral, when she'd barely been able to get dressed. Let alone drive to medical appointments she didn't remember making. Her pill organizer sat beside the papers, each compartment filled with the medications that kept her blood pressure stable and her heart steady. Simple things. Reliable things. She picked up Thursday's morning section and shook it gently, listening to the familiar rattle. That meant she was taking care of herself the way Floyd had always wanted her to. But these papers suggested something different. They painted a picture of a woman who forgot appointments, who needed cognitive evaluation, who couldn't manage her own medical decisions. At Brennan's pharmacy on J Street, the fluorescent lights felt too bright and the checkout line moved too slowly. Colleen clutched her prescription bag, feeling the weight of plastic bottles that seemed heavier than they should. Mrs. Patterson, the pharmacist she'd known for 8 years, leaned across the counter with a concerned expression. Your copay changed again, dear. Insurance flagged some of your medications for prior authorization. Colleen's stomach dropped. Which medications? The blood pressure medicine and the arthritis prescription. Someone called yesterday about updating your coverage. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the careful tone people used when delivering bad news to seniors. They said you'd been having some confusion about your medications. The word, confusion, hit like a slap. I haven't called anyone. Mrs. Patterson's smile became uncomfortable. These things happen sometimes after a loss. Grief can make everything feel overwhelming. Colleen paid the increased copay with her credit card, watching the numbers on the screen climb higher than they'd been last month. Behind her, other customers shifted impatiently, their shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. She forced a smile that felt like plastic and thanked Mrs. Patterson, hating how small her voice sounded. In the parking lot, she sat in her Honda Civic with the engine running and the air conditioning blowing cool air that couldn't touch the heat in her face. Someone was rewriting her life in medical codes and insurance claims. And she was starting to understand how easy it would be to make an older woman disappear into a system designed to help her. That afternoon, Edwin arrived with grocery bags and the same gentle concern that was starting to feel like a costume he put on before visiting. How are you feeling today, Colleen? He set the bags on her counter and began unpacking items she hadn't asked for. Protein shakes, pre-made dinners, pill reminder strips. I'm fine, Edwin. You seem a little scattered lately. Forgetting appointments, confused about bills. He pulled out a bottle of supplements labeled for memory support. It's completely normal after what you've been through. Colleen watched him arrange the items in her cabinet like he was organizing a child's lunchbox. I haven't forgotten anything. Edwin paused, holding a can of soup, and looked at her with the patient expression adults used with elderly relatives. Dr. Brennan called Dad's old number by mistake. He was concerned when you missed your follow-up. I never had an appointment with Dr. Brennan. Memory can be tricky during grief. Edwin's voice stayed soft, understanding, but his eyes held something else. These things sneak up on us. Dad worried about this. The lie hit her like cold water. Floyd had never worried about her memory. He'd trusted her to manage their bills, their medications, their entire household for over 2 decades. But Edwin spoke with such gentle certainty that for a moment, she almost doubted herself. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Banking alert inquiry regarding safety deposit box access. Colleen stared at the notification, her pulse quickening. She hadn't requested anything about a safety deposit box. Is everything all right? Edwin moved closer, trying to see her phone screen. Colleen turned the phone face down. Just spam. But as Edwin continued organizing her kitchen like she couldn't manage it herself, she noticed how his movements were too confident, too familiar. Like he'd been planning this reorganization for weeks. That evening, she called First National Bank and got transferred twice before reaching someone who could help. The hold music played tinny and repetitive through her phone speaker while she sat at Floyd's desk, the leather chair creaking under her weight. Mrs. Whitaker? Yes, there was an inquiry about Box 379. Family member verification for estate purposes. I didn't request any verification. A pause. Papers rustling in the background. The inquiry came from Edwin Whitaker. He said he was helping you sort through your husband's affairs. Colleen's hand tightened on the phone. Edwin doesn't have authorization for my accounts. Ma'am, he mentioned that you've been having some difficulty managing paperwork since your husband's passing. He was quite concerned about your well-being. The same word again. Confused. Difficulty managing. She hung up without saying goodbye, her hands shaking as she set the phone back in its cradle. A new email notification popped up on her laptop screen, the blue glow harsh in the dimming room. Urgent, your computer has been infected. Call now for immediate assistance. The number looked familiar, and when she scrolled through her recent call log, she found it the same number that had been calling her with blocked caller ID. The coincidence felt like a trap. Sydney's text arrived as she was closing the laptop. Let's finalize probate quickly, Colleen. Dad would want everything settled efficiently. We can handle all the paperwork for you. She reread the message 3 times, focusing on the word, efficiently. Not carefully, not thoroughly, efficiently, like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. The brass key felt warm in her purse when she touched it through the leather. Floyd had hidden it for a reason, and now she was beginning to understand that some secrets were meant to be protective rather than deceptive. Edwin showed up unannounced the next morning with a folder full of forms and the same patient smile that was starting to feel like a uniform. He spread the papers across her kitchen table beside her pill organizer, the documents crisp and official looking. These are just authorization forms, he said, uncapping a pen with a soft click. To help streamline things, representative payee status, medical decision support, financial oversight, standard procedures for recently widowed seniors. The phrases sounded official, but they felt like chains. Colleen pulled the papers closer, squinting at the fine print that seemed designed to discourage reading. In the corner of one form, she caught a glimpse of a sticky note with Box 379 inches written in Edwin's handwriting before he quickly covered it with his hand. What's in Box 379? She asked. Edwin's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm not sure what you mean. But the way his fingers pressed against the paper, covering the note completely, told her everything she needed to know. They weren't helping her manage Floyd's estate. They were managing her. That night, she lay in bed listening to the house settle around her, the familiar sounds now feeling like a countdown to something she couldn't name. The Medicare EOBs sat on her nightstand, the unfamiliar charges glowing in her memory like warning signs she'd been trained not to read. For 67 years, she'd been taught to trust authority, to defer to expertise, to let others handle complicated things. But in the darkness of her bedroom, with Floyd's pillow still carrying the faint scent of his cologne, Colleen understood that her education was beginning exactly when everyone expected it to end. They weren't helping her survive, they were helping themselves win. The law office of Martin Morrison occupied the 15th floor of a glass building that reflected Sacramento's morning sun like a giant mirror. Colleen rode the elevator up, watching the numbers climb while her stomach sank with each floor. The brass buttons felt cold under her fingertip, and the elevator music, something soft and meaningless, couldn't mask the sound of her own heartbeat. Edwin stood beside her in his best suit, the fabric expensive and perfectly tailored. Sydney waited in the lobby, his phone pressed to his ear, conducting business that couldn't wait for family matters. They moved through the world like they owned it, and today, Colleen was beginning to fear they might own her too. The conference room walls were all glass, offering a view of downtown Sacramento that should have been impressive but felt exposed instead. Everything was visible from every angle, like being displayed in a fishbowl. Colleen sat in a leather chair that was too big for her frame, her Medicare EOBs and Social Security letter organized in a neat folder that suddenly seemed inadequate. Martin Morrison entered with the confident stride of a man who solved problems for a living. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, his gray hair perfectly styled for a man in his 50s who understood the value of appearances. He spread papers across the conference table like a dealer arranging cards. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm sorry for your loss." His voice carried professional sympathy, the kind that felt genuine until you realized it came from years of practice. "Your stepsons have filled me in on the situation." Sydney slid into the chair across from her, adjusting his tie with one smooth motion. "We want to make this as easy as possible for Mother. She's been through so much." The word mother sounded different in this room, less like affection and more like a legal designation. Colleen opened her folder, the paper rustling too loudly in the quiet space. "I brought my Medicare statements. There are charges I don't understand." Martin glanced at the EOBs with the polite interest lawyers showed to irrelevant documents. "Medical billing can be confusing. That's why it's helpful to have family assistance with these matters." Edwin leaned forward, his expression concerned and caring. "Colleen's been having some trouble keeping track of appointments, paperwork. The stress of losing Dad has been overwhelming." "That's perfectly normal," Martin said, making a note on his legal pad. "Grief affects everyone differently." Colleen felt the conversation moving around her like water flowing past a stone. "I haven't been confused. Someone made medical appointments in my name without my knowledge." Sydney's pen clicked against the table, a rhythmic sound that filled the brief silence. "Mother, you've been under tremendous stress. It's possible you arranged these things and forgot." The dismissal landed like a physical blow. In this room of glass and polished wood, surrounded by men in expensive suits. Her protests sounded exactly like the complaints of a confused elderly woman who couldn't manage her own affairs. Martin opened a thick folder labeled with Floyd's name. "Let's focus on the estate matters. There are significant debts that need to be addressed." Edwin slid a document across the table toward her. The numbers swam together under the fluorescent lights: medical bills, credit card balances, property liens. $180,000 in total debt that somehow carried Floyd's signature but didn't match any expenses she remembered. "Your husband was apparently struggling financially toward the end," Martin said, his tone gentle but firm. "He may not have wanted to worry you with these details." Colleen stared at the numbers, feeling dizzy. Floyd had always handled their finances, but he'd never hidden debt from her. They'd lived modestly, saved carefully, planned for retirement together. These bills described a different life entirely. "I don't understand where this debt came from." Sydney's voice carried patience stretched thin. "Dad was proud, Colleen. He didn't want to burden you. But the bills don't disappear just because he did." The weight of $180,000 pressed against her chest like a physical thing. The house she'd lived in for 2 decades, the savings account Floyd had built over 40 years of work. The retirement security she'd counted on, all of it suddenly felt fragile. Martin continued, his voice steady and professional. "Given the debt situation and the complexity of managing estate affairs, we recommend transferring primary residence ownership to avoid complications. Your stepsons are willing to assume responsibility for the property and its associated costs." "You want me to give up the house?" "Not give up," Edwin said quickly. "You can stay as long as you need. We just want to protect you from financial liability." Sydney nodded, his expression serious and caring. "The debt collection process can be brutal for seniors. This way, you're protected." But protection felt suspiciously like displacement. Colleen gripped the edge of the table, feeling the smooth wood under her palms. "How long would I have?" 30 days to make the transition, Martin said, flipping through his calendar. "That should give you time to arrange alternate housing." 30 days. The phrase echoed in the glass-walled room like a countdown timer. Colleen looked around the table at faces that showed concern and sympathy and something else she couldn't quite name. Calculation, perhaps. Or satisfaction. I'd like to review these documents before signing anything. Sydney's smile tightened. Of course. But the deadline for estate filing is firm. If we miss it, the penalties and interest will make everything much worse. Martin's assistant entered with a file that made her heart stop. The label read, Whitaker Estate, revision 3 inches with a date from 2 months before Floyd died. But Sydney had told her this was Floyd's final will, updated just weeks before his passing. Sydney noticed her attention and shifted his chair to block her view of the file. These legal procedures can seem overwhelming, but we're here to guide you through every step. Edwin reached across the table and touched her hand with what should have been comfort. We know this is a lot to process. Grief can make everything feel confusing. There was that word again. Confused. Like it was the only explanation for her questions, her hesitation, her desire to understand what was happening to her life. Colleen stood too quickly, her knee complaining with a sharp twinge that made her grip the table for balance. The brief stumble drew sympathetic looks from all 3 men. The kind of concerned expressions people wore when watching elderly relatives struggle with simple tasks. See? Sydney said gently. You're overwhelmed. Let us handle the complicated stuff. Her body's moment of weakness had become evidence of mental incompetence. In this room of glass walls and expensive furniture, she wasn't. Floyd's wife of 23 years, or a woman who had managed a household and raised children and built a life worth protecting. She was just another confused senior who needed managing. Martin gathered the papers with the efficiency of a man accustomed to handling difficult family situations. Why don't you take some time to process this information? We can meet again in a few days. But Colleen understood that processing time was really decision time, and the decision had already been made. They were just waiting for her to accept it. In the elevator going down, Sydney and Edwin flanked her like bodyguards, their presence protective and suffocating at the same time. The numbers counted down floor by floor, each floor marking another step away from the life she'd known and towards something she couldn't yet see clearly. We'll take care of everything, Edwin said as they reached the lobby. You don't need to worry about any of this. Through the glass lobby windows, Sacramento looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago. The same traffic, the same sunshine, the same world continuing its business while hers fell apart in 15 floors of legal paperwork and gentle manipulation. In that glass office, she hadn't been a wife or a person or even a problem to be solved. She had been an obstacle to be removed, politely but efficiently, for everyone's good including her own. The brass key in her purse felt heavier as she walked to her car, like it was gaining weight with each step away from the building. Where her life had just been reorganized without her permission. The kitchen felt different when Colleen returned home. The same fluorescent light hummed overhead, the same refrigerator cycled on with its familiar hum. But the air felt thinner, like the house was holding its breath. She dropped her purse on the counter with more force than necessary, and the brass key inside clinked against her reading glasses case, a small, sharp sound that seemed too loud in the silence. Her hands shook as she pressed her forehead against the cool countertop. Breathing in the faint scent of the lemon cleaner she'd used that morning when the world still made sense. 30 days. The phrase echoed in her mind like a countdown timer that had already started running. She opened her banking app with trembling fingers, the phone screen too bright in the dim kitchen. The balance looked smaller than it should have for a woman whose husband had worked 40 years and saved diligently for retirement. Another notification appeared as she watched mortgage servicing inquiry account review requested by a state representative. But Floyd had always told her the house was paid off. They'd celebrated the final payment 3 years ago. With dinner at their favorite restaurant, toasting their financial freedom with wine that tasted like accomplishment. She scrolled through the bank statements, looking for evidence of mortgage payments that shouldn't exist. And found them monthly withdrawals to Granite Bay lending that had appeared after Floyd's first heart attack. When had he taken out a second mortgage? And why hadn't he told her? The Social Security envelope still sat on the table where Edwin had tried to hide it under his folder. She tore it open again, reading the same devastating words: benefit change notification, representative payee update pending, address modification requested. Someone had submitted paperwork claiming she needed help managing her own Social Security benefits. Her coffee had gone cold while she was at the lawyer's office, but she drank it anyway, the bitter taste matching the feeling in her stomach. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mrs. Chen watering her garden next door, moving slowly but steadily among her tomato plants. Normal life continuing while hers was being dismantled piece by piece. Edwin called as she was trying to make sense of a Medicare statement that listed appointments she'd never made. His voice carried the same gentle concern that was starting to sound like a recording played too many times. "How are you feeling after the meeting, Colleen?" Confused, she admitted, then immediately regretted using the word that had been thrown at her all day. "That's completely understandable. These legal matters are complex, and you've been under so much stress." His pause felt calculated. "The important thing is that you don't have to handle any of this alone." "Edwin, did Floyd really have that much debt?" Another pause, longer this time. "Dad was proud, Colleen. He didn't want to worry you with financial problems. But the bills are real, and they don't go away just because we don't want to deal with them." But the house was paid off. Things got complicated during his illness. Medical bills, refinancing to cover costs. He was trying to protect you from the stress of it all. The explanation sounded reasonable, but it described a Floyd she didn't recognize. The man she'd married had shared every financial decision with her, from grocery budgets to investment choices. He'd trusted her judgment and valued her input on everything that affected their future together. "Don't worry about the details," Edwin continued. "Sydney and I will take care of everything. You just need to focus on taking care of yourself." After he hung up, Colleen sat at the kitchen table staring at the pile of papers that seemed to be rewriting her entire life. Bills for medical appointments she didn't remember. Insurance claims for treatments she hadn't received. Social Security modifications she hadn't requested. Someone was telling a story about her in official documents and legal filings, and in that story, she was a confused elderly woman who needed help managing the simplest aspects of her own existence. She searched Floyd's office again, pulling out drawers and looking behind files. With the desperate energy of someone looking for proof that her own memories were real. Under a stack of old tax returns, she found Floyd's hospital discharge folder. Inside, mixed with medication lists and follow-up instructions, was a business card for First National Bank on J Street. On the back of the card, in Floyd's careful handwriting, "Box 379 for Colleen when I'm gone." Her breath caught in her throat. The brass key in her purse suddenly made perfect sense, warm against her palm like Floyd's hand guiding her towards something important he'd left behind. But before she could process what this might mean, her phone rang again. The same blocked number that had been calling for days, now persistent enough to feel like harassment. She let it go to voicemail, but the missed call notification felt like a threat. The tech support scam email appeared on her laptop again, more urgent this time. "Final warning, your computer will be permanently locked unless you call immediately." The phone number was the same one that had been calling her, and she realized the coordination wasn't coincidental. Someone was running multiple scams targeting her specifically, and they knew enough about her situation to time their attacks for maximum effectiveness. A recently widowed woman, overwhelmed by legal proceedings, isolated and vulnerable, she was the perfect victim for multiple types of fraud. Sydney's text arrived as she was closing the laptop. "Let's get those papers signed tomorrow, Colleen. The sooner we handle this, the sooner you can move forward with your life." Move forward. Like her current life was something to escape rather than something to protect. That night, she sat on Floyd's side of the bed, holding his pillow against her chest. The fabric still carried the faint scent of his cologne, a comfort that was fading a little more each day. The house settled around her with its familiar sounds, but for the first time in 23 years, she felt like an intruder in her own home. The brass key sat on the nightstand beside her reading glasses, and the bottle of blood pressure medication that had tripled in price since someone decided she needed cognitive evaluation. Such a small thing to carry so much weight. She thought about Floyd's last weeks, how he'd grown quiet and thoughtful, spending long hours in his office with papers he hadn't shared. She'd assumed he was organizing things for her benefit, making sure she'd be taken care of after he was gone. Now she wondered if he'd been trying to protect her from something else entirely. The Medicare EOBs spread across her lap looked like evidence of a life she hadn't lived, appointments she hadn't made, treatments she hadn't received. But in the eyes of insurance companies and government agencies, these papers were more real than her own memory. She whispered to the empty room, "I will read every paper with my name on it." The words felt like a vow, small but fierce in the darkness of her bedroom. Tomorrow, she would visit First National Bank on J Street. She would use Floyd's key to open box 379. And she would finally understand what he'd been trying to tell her in the careful handwriting on the back of that business card. If they wanted her silence, they had chosen the wrong widow. The memory came to Colleen in the quiet hour before dawn, sharp and complete like a photograph developing in slow motion. She was standing at the kitchen sink 5 years ago, scrubbing coffee stains from Floyd's favorite mug while he sat at the table, wrestling with Medicare EOB forms that didn't make sense. She could see him clearly now, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his pen moving across the papers in frustrated circles. "They're trying to charge me for a cardiologist I never saw," he'd said, holding up the form with one hand and reaching for her with the other. "Call them," she'd suggested, drying her hands on the kitchen towel that still hung beside the same sink. "I did. They said their records show I was there." Floyd's voice had carried the particular exhaustion of someone fighting a system designed to wear him down. "They said stress can make older adults forget medical appointments." Even then, 5 years ago, someone had been planting seeds of the same story now growing around her own life. Confused seniors, forgotten appointments, stress-related memory problems. She remembered how Floyd had slid her Medicare card gently back toward her across the table, his fingers warm against hers. "Paper can't define you, sweetheart," he'd said, kissing her forehead with lips that tasted like morning coffee. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that paperwork knows more about your life than you do." At the time, she'd thought he was just being Floyd protective and philosophical, seeing larger meanings in small frustrations. Now she understood he'd been giving her a weapon she was only learning to use. Back in the present, Colleen sat at the same kitchen table where that conversation had happened, watching early morning light creep across the Medicare EOBs spread in front of her. The neurology consultation charges looked less confusing now, and more deliberate breadcrumbs leading toward a diagnosis of cognitive decline that would justify everything that came after. She remembered Edwin's visits during Floyd's illness, how he'd always arrived with folders and forms, always ready to help with paperwork that seemed to multiply whenever he was around. She could see him now in her memory, closing Floyd's laptop the moment she entered the room, then turning with that same gentle smile that had become his signature. "Just business stuff," he'd say, sliding documents into his briefcase with movements that were always just slightly too quick. "Nothing you need to worry about." How many times had Floyd tried to show her something on that laptop, only to find the files mysteriously reorganized or moved? How many times had Edwin offered to help with mail, sorting what she was allowed to see from what was too complicated for someone dealing with the stress of a spouse's illness? The pattern had been there for months, maybe longer. She'd been trained not to see it. Colleen pulled out Floyd's personal effects bag from the hospital, the plastic crinkling like autumn leaves. His wallet still smelled faintly of leather and antiseptic, a combination that brought his last days rushing back. Behind his driver's license, tucked carefully against the plastic window, she found a folded business card for First National Bank on J Street. But it wasn't the bank card that made her hands shake. It was what Floyd had written on the back in his careful handwriting, "Box 379 for Colleen when I'm gone. Trust yourself. Trust yourself." Like he'd known she would need the reminder. She remembered their last real conversation, the one that hadn't been interrupted by nurses or interrupted by Edwin's helpful visits. Floyd had been sitting up in the hospital bed, the evening light making his skin look paper thin but his eyes still clear and focused. "Promise me you'll read everything after I'm gone," he'd said, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "Everything, Colleen. Don't let anyone summarize things for you or tell you what's important. Read it all yourself," she'd promised, thinking he was worried about insurance claims and estate paperwork. Simple things that any competent adult should be able to handle. She hadn't understood he was trying to prepare her for a war she didn't know was coming. Floyd had been quiet those last weeks, spending long hours staring at the ceiling with an expression she'd mistaken for pain medication fog. Now she realized it had been the look of a man working out a strategy, trying to leave her tools she could use after he was no longer there to protect her. The safety deposit box key felt warm in her palm, the metal warming to her body temperature like it was coming alive. She thought about all the nighttime conversations Floyd had stopped having with her, the way he'd started keeping his voice low during phone calls. The subtle tension in his shoulders whenever Edwin visited. He'd been trying to tell her something without using words that could be overheard or repeated. Colleen gathered the Medicare EOBs, the Social Security letter, the bank statements that didn't match her memories, and the mortgage documents that described debt she'd never known existed. She arranged them in a neat pile, then placed Floyd's brass key on top like a paperweight that could anchor her to the truth. The phone rang, another blocked number, another attempt to panic her into making bad decisions quickly. But instead of ignoring it or feeling harassed by it, she listened to the mechanical rings with something approaching curiosity. Someone was working very hard to keep her off balance, to make her feel isolated and overwhelmed. The effort itself was evidence that she had something worth protecting. For the first time in weeks, Colleen felt her spine straighten with something that wasn't grief or confusion, or the desperate need to make other people comfortable with her existence. Floyd hadn't left her defenseless. He'd left her armed with information and the brass key to unlock it. She was done being managed. She was done accepting other people's interpretations of her own life. And she was definitely done pretending that politeness was more important than protecting herself. The bank would open in 3 hours. Box 379 had been waiting for her, and Floyd's careful handwriting was calling her home to herself. Grief hadn't vanished, it simply changed direction. First National, like every other mid-size bank branch in Sacramento, brick facade, tinted windows, and a parking lot that suggested steady business without ostentation. But as Colleen walked through the glass doors with Floyd's brass key clutched in her palm, the building felt as significant as a courthouse where her verdict would finally be delivered. The lobby hummed with quiet efficiency. Tellers processed transactions behind bulletproof glass while customers filled out deposit slips and waited, in line with the patient resignation of people accustomed to financial bureaucracy. The air smelled like paper and floor polish and something else she couldn't identify, hope, maybe, or fear. "I need to access a safety deposit box," she told the customer service representative, a woman in her 40s whose name tag read, Patricia. Box 379. Patricia's fingers moved across her computer keyboard with practiced efficiency, but her eyebrows raised slightly when the account information appeared on her screen. "Mrs. Whitaker, yes. I see you have dual access with your late husband. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Colleen's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'll need to see identification and have you sign the access log." Patricia pulled out a clipboard with forms attached. "Has anyone else accessed this box recently?" The question felt loaded with meaning Colleen couldn't quite grasp. "I don't think so. Should they have?" "No, just routine security. Your husband set up very specific instructions about this box." Patricia lowered her voice slightly. "He was quite clear that only you should have access after his passing." They walked through a maze of cubicles and offices to a heavy door marked, "Vault Access Authorized Personnel Only." Patricia swiped her badge and entered a code, and the door opened with a soft electronic beep that sounded like permission being granted. The vault felt like stepping into a cathedral made of steel and fluorescent lighting. Rows of safety deposit boxes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each one a small fortress protecting someone's most important secrets. Their footsteps echoed against the polished floor as Patricia led her to box 379, located at eye level in a corner that felt both hidden and prominent. "I'll need both keys," Patricia said, producing her master key. "Bank policy." Colleen inserted Floyd's brass key with hands that trembled slightly. The metal felt warm against her fingers, like Floyd's hand guiding hers. Both keys turned together with a soft click that sounded like a lock opening in her chest. The box slid out smoothly, heavier than she'd expected. Patricia carried it to a small private room furnished with nothing but a table and 2 chairs. Fluorescent lights that made everything look stark and important, and a security camera mounted discreetly in the corner. Take all the time you need, Patricia said, closing the door with a gentle click that left Colleen alone with whatever Floyd had been trying to tell her. Inside the box, manila folders were organized with the careful attention Floyd had always brought to important things. Each folder was labeled in his precise handwriting: medical records, real, financial documentation, legal correspondence, and finally. For Colleen, read this first. Her hands shook as she opened the final folder and found a letter addressed to her in Floyd's familiar script, dated just 2 weeks before his death. My dearest Colleen, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened and my sons are trying to steal your life the same way they tried to steal mine. I've been documenting their activities for 18 months, ever since I discovered Sydney's debt and Edwin's schemes. You were never confused. You never forgot appointments. You never needed cognitive evaluation or financial management. They created those records to build a case for your incompetence, just like they tried to do with me. Everything you need to fight them is in this box. Bank statements showing the real accounts they don't know about. Documentation of forged signatures on mortgage documents. Evidence of Medicare fraud and identity theft. Private investigator reports on both boys' financial situations. You are not a burden. You are not confused. You are not too old to protect yourself. You are the strongest woman I've ever known, and you have every legal right to defend what we built together. Call James Mitchell. His card is in the financial folder. He knows everything and he's waiting for your call. I love you. I trust you. And I'm sorry I couldn't fight this battle for both of us. Forever yours, Floyd. The letter blurred as tears filled Colleen's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of validation, of understanding that her instincts had been right all along. Floyd had been protecting her in the only way he could by documenting the truth and leaving her the tools to use it. The other folders contained enough evidence to fill a legal brief. Bank statements showing a protected account with $2 million that Sydney and Edwin didn't know existed. Copies of the real will, signed and witnessed properly, leaving everything to Colleen with only modest gifts to the boys. Documentation showing that the mortgage on their house had been taken out using forged signatures after Floyd's first heart attack. Most damning of all was a private investigator's report on Sydney's law practice. Gambling debts, client fund shortages, pending bar disciplinary action, and a desperate need for immediate cash that explained why he couldn't wait for Floyd to die naturally. Colleen sat back in the uncomfortable chair, feeling like a woman who had just discovered she wasn't crazy. Wasn't failing, wasn't too old to understand her own life. She was a widow whose stepsons had been systematically stealing her identity. And her future, confident that society would believe 2 successful men over one grieving senior. Her phone buzzed with another blocked call, but instead of feeling harassed, she felt entertained. Someone was working very hard to panic her into bad decisions, and now she knew exactly who and why. She gathered the folders carefully, placing them back in the box with the reverent attention of someone handling evidence that would restore her life. Floyd had given her everything she needed to fight back, but more importantly, he'd given her permission to stop being polite about her own survival. James Mitchell's business card listed an address in Midtown Sacramento, and his answering service assured her he could see her that afternoon. The woman on the phone seemed to recognize her name, as if she'd been expecting this call for months. As Colleen walked out of the bank with Floyd's documentation tucked safely in her purse, Sacramento looked different. The same streets and buildings and traffic patterns, but now she was seeing them as a woman. With legal standing and documentary evidence instead of a confused senior who needed help managing her own affairs. For the first time in weeks, their urgency didn't scare her. It entertained her. James Mitchell's office occupied the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian house in Midtown Sacramento. The kind of building that suggested competence without intimidation. Colleen climbed the narrow stairs with Floyd's documentation clutched against her chest. Each step feeling like progress towards something that had been stolen from her. The waiting area smelled like coffee and old wood, furnished with chairs that invited sitting rather than perching nervously. Legal books lined the shelves, but they were mixed with family photos. And a small sign that read, "Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice documented is justice served." Mitchell himself looked nothing like the polished attorneys she'd been dealing with. Mid-60s, silver hair that looked professionally messy, and eyes that focused completely on her face when she spoke. Rather than scanning the room for more important things to notice. Mrs. Whitaker. His handshake was firm without being aggressive. Floyd told me you might be calling. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry it took this long for us to meet. You knew my husband? We worked together for the last year of his life. He was documenting some very serious crimes being committed against both of you. Mitchell gestured toward a chair across from his desk. He wanted to handle this himself, but his health didn't allow it. The office felt like a sanctuary from the glass-walled conference rooms and polished surfaces where she'd been diminished and dismissed. Here, her manila folders looked important rather than pathetic, evidence rather than confusion. Mitchell spread Floyd's documentation across his desk with the careful attention of someone who had been expecting this moment. Bank statements, medical records, private investigator reports, and copies of legal documents. That told a story of systematic elder abuse and financial exploitation. This is comprehensive, he said, scanning through papers with the focused attention of a man reading a battle plan. Floyd was thorough. Your stepsons have been running multiple scams against you simultaneously. I thought I was losing my mind. That was the point. Elder abuse often works by making victims doubt their own perceptions. Mitchell pulled out a fresh legal pad. Tell me about the Medicare charges and the Social Security modifications. Colleen described the neurology appointments she'd never made, the cognitive evaluation she'd never consented to, the representative payee modifications she'd never requested. As she spoke, Mitchell made notes in handwriting that looked as precise as Floyd's. Identity theft, Medicare fraud, and unauthorized Social Security modifications, he said when she finished. All federal crimes. The mortgage fraud adds banking violations, and the probate manipulation involves state court jurisdiction. Can we stop them? Mitchell's smile was the first expression of confidence she'd seen from a lawyer in weeks. Mrs. Whitaker, we're not going to stop them. We're going to destroy them. That afternoon, they drove to Morrison's law office in Mitchell's practical Honda rather than Colleen's car. She wanted to arrive as someone's client rather than someone's burden, represented rather than managed. The same glass conference room that had felt like a fishbowl now felt like a courtroom where she held the evidence. Sydney and Edwin were already seated, their expensive suits somehow looking less authoritative when Mitchell entered. Carrying a briefcase that suggested serious legal preparation. Martin Morrison looked confused by the addition of another attorney, especially one who didn't seem inclined toward polite cooperation. I wasn't aware Mrs. Whitaker had independent counsel. She does now. Mitchell set his briefcase on the table with a solid thunk that commanded attention. And she's prepared to discuss the systematic elder abuse and financial exploitation that's been perpetrated against her. Sydney's pen stopped clicking. Edwin's gentle smile froze in place like a mask someone had forgotten to animate. The air in the room shifted from patronizing sympathy to something that felt like fear. That's a very serious accusation, Morrison said carefully. Yes, it is. Mitchell opened his briefcase and began placing documents on the table in neat stacks. Forged signatures on mortgage documents. Medicare fraud totaling over $40,000. Identity theft for Social Security benefit modifications. Probate fraud involving suppression of the actual will. Each phrase landed like a physical blow. Colleen watched Sydney's face cycle through disbelief, calculation, and something approaching panic as Mitchell continued laying out evidence that Floyd had been collecting for over a year. This is ridiculous, Sydney said, but his voice lacked the confident dismissal she'd grown accustomed to. Mother has been under tremendous stress. She's clearly being manipulated by an unscrupulous attorney. Mitchell slid a bank statement across the table toward Morrison. That's Mrs. Whitaker's protected account, containing $2.3 million that your clients attempted to hide during probate proceedings. Would you like to explain to the court how they planned to claim ignorance of these assets? The silence that followed felt like gravity shifting in the room. Morrison's pen moved across his legal pad in short, nervous strokes while Sydney and Edwin exchanged glances that communicated things Colleen was finally learning to read. Here's the real will, Mitchell continued, placing another document in front of Morrison. Properly executed, witnessed, and notarized. Your clients have been proceeding with a previous version they knew had been superseded. Edwin finally spoke, his voice carrying less of the gentle concern that had been his signature. This is all very confusing. Dad changed his will multiple times during his illness. No, he didn't. Colleen's voice surprised her with its steadiness. He changed it once, after he discovered what you were doing to us. She reached into her purse and placed the brass key on the conference table. The small piece of metal catching the fluorescent light like evidence that had always been there, waiting for someone to pay attention. Floyd left me everything I needed to protect myself, including documentation of your gambling debts, Sydney, and your client fund shortages. Sydney's face went white. Edwin's shoulders sagged like someone had cut the strings holding him upright. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, the movement casual but somehow threatening. We can resolve this civilly, or we can involve federal prosecutors. Medicare fraud and Social Security abuse carry serious prison time, especially when committed against vulnerable seniors. What do you want? Morrison asked, his professional composure finally cracking. Mitchell slid a document across the table. Mrs. Whitaker is prepared to deed the properties to your clients along with all associated mortgages and debt that they created through fraudulent refinancing. They can have exactly what they tried to steal, but they'll also inherit the financial liability they created. The irony was perfect. Sydney and Edwin would get their inheritance, but it would come with debt that exceeded the property's value. They could choose bankruptcy or they could walk away with nothing, but they could no longer steal what belonged to Colleen. Edwin signed first, his pen moving across the paper with the defeated motion of someone who had run out of options. Sydney held out longer, his jaw clenched with rage that had nowhere to go, but eventually signed with handwriting that looked angry enough to tear the paper. Morrison's assistant notarized the documents while Colleen watched her stepson's schemes collapse under the weight of their own greed. They'd been so confident that an elderly widow would be easy to manipulate that they'd never prepared for organized resistance. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Sydney stopped at the conference room door. For a moment, his mask slipped completely, and she saw the raw fury of someone who had been outplayed by a person he'd considered beneath serious consideration. This isn't over, he said quietly. Mitchell's response was even quieter. Yes, it is. The elevator ride down felt like descending from a mountain she'd been climbing for months. Through the lobby windows, Sacramento looked exactly the same, but Colleen felt like someone who had just reclaimed citizenship in her own life. Outside the building, Mitchell handed her a business card and shook her hand with the respect of one professional acknowledging another. Floyd would be proud of you. He saved my life. No, Mitchell said, his eyes kind but serious. He gave you tools. You saved your own life. That evening, Colleen sat at her kitchen table with Floyd's coffee mug filled with tea. Watching the sun set through windows that looked out on a yard that belonged to her again. The Medicare EOBs and Social Security letters were stacked neatly beside her. But now they looked like evidence of crimes rather than evidence of her incompetence. Her phone rang once, a blocked number that she answered with confidence rather than fear. This is Colleen Whitaker. I know who this is, I know what you're trying to do, and if you call again, I'll report this number to the FBI's Elder Fraud Unit. The line went dead immediately. For the first time in months, the silence in her house felt like peace rather than abandonment. She still missed Floyd with an ache that touched everything she did, but she no longer felt like she was disappearing along with him. They had taken her grief for weakness and learned it was a weapon pointed the other way. 6 months later, Colleen woke to the sound of fog rolling off Monterey Bay. A gentle susurrus that reminded her every morning that she'd chosen this new life rather than having it chosen for her. The cottage in Carmel was smaller than the Sacramento house, but every corner belonged to her completely. Her morning routine had simplified into something that felt like meditation. Water into the kettle, listening for the first whisper that would become a boil. Earl Grey tea steep for exactly 4 minutes while she arranged her pills in their daily organizer, the same medications. But now she knew exactly what each one did and why she took it. The blood pressure medicine that Sydney and Edwin had tried to use as evidence of cognitive decline. The arthritis medication that helped her tend the small garden Floyd would have loved. Simple things that kept her body steady while her life found its new rhythm. Through the kitchen window, she could see cypress trees bent by coastal winds and the distant gray line where ocean met sky. The view cost half of what she'd been spending on the Sacramento house. And it came with something she hadn't expected: neighbors who knew her as Colleen rather than as Floyd's widow or as someone's elderly problem. The senior center on Ocean Avenue had become her Tuesday morning destination, not because she needed activities to fill empty time, but because she'd volunteered to teach a class called Protecting Yourself from Scams. The students were mostly women her age who'd been targeted by variations of the schemes that had nearly destroyed her life. Always ask for everything in writing, she told the class, standing in front of a whiteboard covered with examples of Medicare fraud and Social Security scams. And never let anyone tell you that asking questions means you're confused. Mrs. Rodriguez raised her hand tentatively. My son-in-law keeps saying I should let him handle my banking because it's too complicated for seniors. What makes banking too complicated for someone who's been managing money for 60 years? Colleen asked gently. And why would it become complicated exactly when someone else wants to take control of it? The recognition in Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes was something Colleen had learned to watch for the moment when a woman realized that her own instincts had been right all along. After class, she drove to the nonprofit legal clinic where she volunteered 2 afternoons a week. The office occupied a converted storefront near the courthouse, serving clients who couldn't afford attorneys but needed help fighting systems designed to wear them down through complexity and delay. Today's client was a widow whose adult children were trying to have her declared incompetent so they could sell her house. The story was so familiar that Colleen could have told it herself, the concerned family members. The medical appointments she didn't remember making, the sudden pile of debt that appeared after her husband's death. Did you bring the Medicare statements? Colleen asked, spreading papers across the small conference table. Yes, but I don't understand them. Let's read them together. Colleen pointed to the service codes that indicated psychological evaluation and cognitive assessment. Do you remember seeing Drive Peterson for dementia testing? The woman's confusion was genuine, not the performed bewilderment that family members would later use as evidence of incompetence. I've never seen Drive Peterson. I don't even know who that is. Colleen made notes on a legal pad, the familiar process of documenting fraud that she'd learned through necessity and now practiced as a form of justice. Each case was different, but the pattern was always the same: isolation, confusion, and the systematic undermining of an older person's confidence in their own perceptions. You're not confused, she told the woman. Someone is trying to confuse you. There's a difference. That afternoon brought news she'd been expecting but still felt strange to hear. James Mitchell called with an update on Sydney's legal situation: bankruptcy filing, loss of his law license, and a plea agreement that included restitution and community service but no jail time. Edwin lost his professional certifications and he's working retail now, Mitchell added. Bianca filed for divorce and moved back to her parents' house. Colleen listened without the satisfaction she'd expected to feel. Justice had been served, but it felt more like watching a house fire be extinguished than like watching fireworks celebrate victory. Do you think they learned anything? She asked. I think they learned that elder abuse has consequences, Mitchell replied. Whether they learned empathy is another question entirely. She spent the evening in her garden, deadheading roses. Floyd had taught her to grow and planting herbs that would fill the cottage with scents he would have appreciated. The physical work felt like meditation, her hands in the soil connecting her to something larger than legal battles and family betrayals. The foundation she'd started with part of Floyd's hidden money had funded its first legal clinic and was planning 2 more. The Whitaker Foundation for Senior Financial Justice provided attorneys for elder abuse cases and education programs for banks and medical facilities to recognize exploitation when they saw it. The irony wasn't lost on her that Sydney and Edwin's greed had created a resource that would help hundreds of seniors protect themselves from the same schemes they'd used against her. Their names would be associated with justice rather than with theft, though not in the way they'd planned. As the sun set behind the cypress trees, Colleen sat on her small porch with Floyd's coffee mug filled with chamomile tea. The mug had made the trip from Sacramento carefully wrapped in bubble wrap, one of the few material things she'd truly needed to bring with her into this new life. Her phone had been quiet for months. No blocked numbers, no tech support scams, no helpful relatives offering to manage things she was supposedly too confused to understand. The peace felt earned rather than given, protection she'd built for herself rather than security that could be taken away by someone else's decisions. The final task of the day was always the same. She sat at the small desk Floyd would have loved, overlooking the garden. They would have tended together and signed her name to something important. Tonight it was a grant letter to fund legal aid for senior exploitation cases in 3 California counties. Her signature moved across the paper in the careful handwriting she'd developed over 67 years of signing her own name to her own decisions. For the first time in years, she signed her own name and it felt completely hers. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. Growing older isn't the end, sometimes it's the first time your life finally belongs to you. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. Thank you for spending this